The challenge, the Reynolds mansion, stood on the edge of the city like a monument to wealth and ambition. Its towering glass walls reflected the skyline in sharp blue fragments, while its endless marble halls echoed with footsteps of servants who moved as quietly as shadows. Every inch of the house carried the smell of polish and the weight of perfection, but perfection was exactly what Richard Reynolds believed he could never find in his own son. Richard was a man whose name opened doors that others could not even knock on. He built empires out of crumbling companies, transformed failures into profits, and forced politicians to bend to his will with nothing more than a phone call. In the financial world, he was a storm that no one dared challenge. But inside his mansion, away from the applause of shareholders and headlines of business magazines, he felt powerless against a 12-year-old boy who carried his last name. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, a place decorated with shelves of rare books he never read and trophies of accomplishments he never cherished. The only thing that mattered to him at that moment was the sheet of paper lying on the desk. Before him, a report card covered in red ink. The teachers had tried to soften their words, writing phrases like needs improvement and below expectations, but the meaning was clear. Ethan, his only son, had failed again. Reading comprehension, writing, spelling, all marked with failing grades. Even mathematics, which Richard thought was the universal language of logic, had collapsed under the boy's struggle. Richard pressed the paper into his palm until it crumpled, his jaw tightening as frustration pulsed through his veins. To a man who had never accepted defeat in business, failure in his own home was unbearable. Across the mansion, Ethan sat at the enormous dining table that seemed designed for banquets rather than homework. The boy's small figure was swallowed by the vastness of the room. His brown hair hung over his eyes as he bent over his notebook, pencil tapping nervously against the page. He had written and erased the same sentence 6 times, each attempt leaving a darker smudge of graphite until the paper nearly tore. His mind felt like a battlefield where words moved too quickly for him to capture, letters twisting and dancing in ways that made no sense. To the outside world, he was the son of a billionaire, destined for privilege and power. To himself, he was a disappointment, trapped in a house where success was not just expected but demanded as a form of survival. Denise Carter moved quietly nearby, dusting the polished frames of portraits that lined the hall. Middle-aged and modestly dressed, Denise had worked in the Reynolds estate for years, long enough to see the cycle of tutors coming and going, each one claiming they could fix Ethan and each one leaving in frustration. Her hands bore the marks of years of labor. Her back carried the quiet weight of sacrifice, yet her eyes held a gentleness that had not dimmed despite the gossip of other staff. To Richard, she was simply the maid, invisible in the way most wealthy men view those who serve them. But to Ethan, she was the only adult who didn't sigh in exasperation when he stumbled over words, the only one who smiled when he tried, even if he failed. The silence of the mansion shattered when Richard's voice rang out from the study. It was not the roar of anger, but the cold sharpness of a blade. This is the last straw. If you fail again, Ethan, you are done here. His tone was measured, but the finality in his words pierced deeper than any shouted threat. Ethan's shoulders tensed and his pencil slipped from his fingers, rolling across the marble floor. His eyes remained fixed on the table, not daring to meet his father's gaze. He had heard similar threats before, but tonight something was different. There was no trace of patience left in Richard's voice. Denise, standing just beyond the archway, froze in place. She had overheard whispers among the staff, how Richard was planning to send Ethan away to a strict boarding school abroad, or worse, to wash his hands of the boy entirely. The idea made her chest tighten. She had seen the boy's struggle up, close. The way he traced words with his finger when he thought no one was watching. The way his lips trembled as he tried to read a simple passage aloud. It wasn't laziness, she knew. It wasn't stupidity either. There was something else. Something no one had taken the time to understand. Later that night, as the household grew quiet and Richard disappeared back into his study with a glass of scotch in hand, Denise found herself in the kitchen cleaning up the remnants of dinner. 2 other workers chatted idly while rinsing plates. "Poor kid," one said, shaking his head. All that money and he can't even read a page straight. Money don't fix everything, you know. The man can buy a new car every week, but he can't buy a new brain for that boy. The other chuckled, drying a glass. They'll ship him off soon. Easier that way. Out of sight, out of mind. Denise said nothing, but her hands trembled as she scrubbed the counter. She knew Ethan's struggle wasn't something to mock. She had seen children like him before, though none had lived in a house this grand. Something about the way the words, twisted on the page for him, reminded her of stories she once read about dyslexia, though she was no expert. Still, she had a growing conviction that Ethan's problem wasn't a lack of intelligence, but a difference in how his mind worked. Later, when she returned to the dining room to collect the boy's books, she found him still sitting there, head buried in his arms. His cheeks were red, his eyes wet with shame. For a long moment, Denise stood silently, unsure if it was her place to speak. But then, driven by a feeling stronger than duty, she placed a gentle hand on the back of his chair. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice soft enough to be mistaken for the wind. "I think I know why it feels so hard for you." The boy lifted, his head, his eyes wide with both hope and disbelief. No one had ever said those words to him before. Most told him he was lazy. Others called him careless. Some even whispered that he was slow. But this was the first time someone suggested that there was a reason behind his struggle, something beyond his control. Before she could say more, footsteps echoed in the hall. Richard entered the room, adjusting his cufflinks, his face carved, with irritation. Denise straightened immediately, her hands tightening around the cloth she carried. Richard's eyes swept over the books, the half-finished homework, the maid standing too close to his son. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. Denise hesitated, but then something inside her refused to remain silent. She took a breath and, for the first time in years, dared to step beyond the boundaries of her role. "Sir, if you let me try, I believe I can help him." Richard blinked, momentarily stunned. Then a short, sharp laugh escaped his lips. "You? You're a maid, Denise. Do you even understand the material he's failing at? I've paid experts, specialists, the best tutors money can buy. They couldn't fix him. And you want me to believe you can?" Denise did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes or stammer an apology as most would in her place. She simply nodded once, her voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. "All I ask is a chance." Richard studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her audacity against the absurdity of her claim. Then he smirked, shaking his head as he walked toward the bar. He poured himself another drink, the ice clinking against the glass before turning back to face her. "Fine," he said finally, his voice laced with sarcasm. "If you can make him pass, I'll promote you. You'll never scrub these floors again, but if you fail, don't expect to keep your job." The challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unyielding. Denise's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. She knew the risk, but she also knew that Ethan deserved someone who believed in him. And for the first time in his life, the boy saw someone willing to fight for him not because of his father's wealth, but because of who he was. That night, as Richard retreated once again to his study, Ethan looked at Denise with cautious hope. She offered him a small smile, one that carried both reassurance and determination. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but in that moment, a quiet promise was made between them. She would not give up on him, no matter what it cost, and somewhere deep within the walls of that mansion built on pride and power, the first spark of change began to flicker. The secret struggle. The next morning began like every other in the Reynolds mansion, but for Ethan there was a heaviness in the air that made him move slower than usual. The towering ceilings and endless windows of the house always seemed to swallow him whole, making him feel smaller than he already felt. He ate breakfast in silence, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate, while his father scanned the financial section of the newspaper. Richard Reynolds didn't look up once, didn't acknowledge his son's slumped posture, and didn't ask a single question about the long night before. For him, silence was a form of punishment, and Ethan felt its weight pressing on him harder than if his father had shouted. Denise, moving between the kitchen and dining hall, pretended not to notice. But in her heart, she was carrying the memory of the challenge Richard had thrown at her. His words had not been casual. They were spoken with the full force of a man used to being obeyed. If she failed, it would cost her not only her job, but also her dignity. Yet she could not ignore the look in Ethan's eyes when she promised to help. For the first time, someone had told him that maybe the problem wasn't him, and that single spark of hope was something she refused to let die. That afternoon, after the school van dropped Ethan at the gate, Denise waited for him in the study room. She had asked permission from no one, but her heart told her that if she didn't act, the boy's future would sink deeper into the shadows. Ethan entered, dragging his backpack across the polished floor, expecting to face another round of frustration. When he saw Denise seated at the table with his books already spread out, he stopped short, confused. "You don't have to do this," he muttered, eyes cast downward. "I know," Denise said gently, "but I want to. And more than that, I believe you can do it," Ethan didn't reply. Years of failure had taught him not to trust encouragement. Words of support usually came before disappointment. Still, he sat down hesitantly, curious about what she might try. Denise did not begin with the assignments his teachers had sent home. Instead, she opened a notebook where she had written large, simple words in clear letters. She asked Ethan to read just one. The boy squinted, his lips forming shapes, but the letters seemed to tumble over each other. "Dog," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Dog." "Good," Denise said, her smile soft but sincere. "Now let's draw it." She handed him a pencil, and together they sketched the outline of a dog. Ethan's hand was clumsy, his lines crooked, but as the shape appeared, he giggled quietly for the first time in days. "It looks like a potato with ears," he said. "That's perfect," Denise replied. "Learning doesn't always have to be about perfection. It's about finding a way that works for you." From that moment, their lessons took a different shape. Denise noticed that Ethan's memory was sharp when connected with images, sounds, or movement, so she used games, songs, and drawings to make words come alive. She asked him to trace letters in flour spread on a tray, to build words with cutout cards, to clap rhythms for each syllable. Slowly, painfully, something began to shift. For the first time, Ethan felt that reading wasn't just a punishment. It was a puzzle he might actually be able to solve. But in the vastness of the mansion, whispers carried easily. Other staff members began to notice Denise spending long hours with the boy. One afternoon in the kitchen, as she prepared a simple snack for Ethan's study break, she overheard two maids chuckling. "She thinks she's a teacher now." One sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. "Imagine the maid turning into a tutor. What does she know about education?" The other laughed. "She's setting herself up for humiliation. When the boy fails again, Mr. Reynolds will toss her out like yesterday's trash." Denise's hands trembled as she carried the tray back to the study room. Their words dug into her like knives, feeding her own doubts. She wasn't trained, she wasn't certified, and she had no academic degree hanging on a wall. All she had were instincts, patience, and a stubborn belief in the boy's potential. Was that enough against a system that had already labeled him a failure? That night, as she returned home to her modest apartment, Denise sat at her small kitchen table staring at a bill for her daughter's college tuition. Her daughter, Sophia, had just been accepted into university, the pride of Denise's life. But the fees were beyond what she could cover with a maid's wages. The promotion Richard had promised if she succeeded burned in her mind like a flickering light in the dark. If she could help Ethan pass, it might mean a better life, not only for herself, but also for her daughter. That thought steadied her resolve. Meanwhile, Richard remained skeptical. Though he rarely spoke of it, he had little faith in Denise's attempts. One evening, curious to see what was happening behind closed doors, he paused outside the study room door. Inside, he saw Ethan struggling to read a short paragraph, stumbling over each word. Denise didn't correct him with impatience. Instead, she guided him gently, asking him to visualize the story in his mind, to imagine the characters like scenes in a movie. Richard shook his head, muttering under his breath. This is child's play. Waste of time. Yet he couldn't deny the flicker of determination he saw in his son's eyes. It unsettled him. The days turned into weeks. Slowly, Ethan's reading improved. Not enough to astonish his teachers, but enough that he could now read a short story aloud without collapsing into frustration. He still struggled, but he no longer quit after the first mistake. Denise celebrated every small victory with genuine joy, and Ethan began to look forward to their sessions. One evening, while working on a reading passage, Ethan confessed something that made Denise's heart ache. Sometimes I feel like I'm broken, like there's something wrong with me that can't be fixed. Denise knelt beside him, taking his small hand into her own. Ethan, you are not broken. You are different, yes, but different is not less. You see the world in ways others don't, and one day that will be your strength. But you must keep going even when it feels impossible. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe her words. He nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his sleeve, and bent once more over his book. The mansion buzzed with rumors as staff continued to gossip. Some pitied Denise for wasting her time. Others predicted her downfall. But what they could not see was the quiet transformation happening in the boy's heart. For the first time in his life, Ethan was not defined by his father's disappointment, but by the belief of someone who saw his hidden light. One night, as Denise walked past Richard's study, he called her in abruptly. "Sit," he said coldly, gesturing toward a chair. She obeyed, unsure of what was coming. Richard leaned back, studying her with narrowed eyes. "Tell me, Denise, do you truly believe he can pass? Or are you simply clinging to hope because you fear losing your job?" Denise held his gaze, her voice steady. "I believe he can pass, sir, but more than that, I believe he deserves someone who believes in him. You may not see it yet, but he has a mind that works differently, not wrongly." Richard scoffed, swirling the ice in his glass. "Belief doesn't change report cards. Results do. You have until the next exam. If he fails, both of you will be finished here." The weight of his words pressed heavily on her, but Denise rose, bowed her head respectfully, and left the study. Her heart raced, but her spirit did not bend. She knew the road ahead would only grow harder. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Ethan was worth the fight. And so, as the city lights twinkled outside the mansion's towering windows, the secret struggle continued. A maid and a boy against the shadows of doubt, bound by hope, battling against time. Neither of them knew what the outcome would be, but for the first time, Ethan did not feel alone in his fight. And for Denise, failure was not an option. Not when a child's future and her own dignity were on the line. The road of trials. The weeks passed like shadows drifting across the Reynolds estate. And with every passing day, Denise could see Ethan changing in ways too subtle for the rest of the world to notice. His posture straightened when he walked into the study room. His eyes no longer darted to the floor with shame whenever a book was placed before him, and he had begun to whisper the words he read under his breath when no one was looking, testing himself, daring to believe that he could do what once seemed impossible. Yet progress, as Denise knew too well, was fragile. It was like a flame flickering against the wind, bright enough to light the darkness, but always at risk of being snuffed out by the first storm. And storms were brewing. Richard Reynolds was a man of numbers, charts, and results, not patience or faith. To him, the weeks of effort meant little if they did not transform into grades that reflected the excellence he demanded. Every time he glanced at his son, hunched over homework with Denise at his side, he felt the sting of humiliation. How could the heir to his empire, a boy born into limitless wealth, struggle with words that any child of ordinary means could master? To Richard, Ethan's failure was not simply personal. It was a threat to his legacy. And in his frustration, he began to watch Denise more closely, waiting for her inevitable collapse. The first true test of their work came one Thursday afternoon when the school sent home a practice exam packet, designed to prepare students for the mid-year tests. Ethan carried the envelope home as though it were a stone chained to his wrist, dreading what awaited inside. By the time he reached the mansion gates, his palms were slick with sweat. Denise met him at the door and instantly saw the fear in his eyes. She knew what the envelope contained before he spoke a word. "Do you want to open it together?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. They sat at the study table, and she carefully slid the papers out. The pages seemed endless, filled with reading passages, comprehension questions, vocabulary, and writing prompts. Ethan's breathing grew shallow. For him, each word was not just a test of knowledge but a mountain he had never been able to climb. That evening they attempted the exam. Ethan stumbled through the reading passage, losing his place, reversing letters, forgetting meanings. Denise guided him patiently, urging him not to panic. Still, when the results came back the following week, the scores were low, not as disastrous as before, but still far from what Richard considered acceptable. Richard entered the dining room that evening holding the results, his face unreadable. He set the papers down in front of Denise as Ethan sat nearby, eyes wide, with dread. "This is what weeks of your teaching has achieved," Richard said coldly. "Slightly less of a failure? Do you expect me to applaud this?" Ethan's face crumpled, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his father's disdain. Denise, however, met Richard's gaze steadily. "Sir," she said firmly, "this is not failure. This is progress. For the first time, your son completed an exam without giving up. That is a victory. Scores will rise, but we cannot measure success only by numbers." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment Denise thought he might dismiss her entirely. But instead he leaned back, swirling the drink in his glass. "You have until the real exam. If he fails then, you both will regret it." The threat lingered in the air, heavy as thunder. Ethan stared down at the table, but Denise reached for his hand under the wood and gave it a quiet squeeze. She would not let him fall back into despair. Yet Richard was not the only obstacle. The fired tutor, Mr. Caldwell, who had once charged thousands of dollars an hour to teach Ethan, had not taken his dismissal kindly. Word spread through the household that he was whispering poison into Richard's ear during chance encounters at social clubs, telling him Denise was wasting his son's future, that an untrained maid had no business playing the role of educator. Caldwell even visited the mansion under the pretense of collecting forgotten materials and sneered when he saw Denise with Ethan. "You think you're doing him a favor?" Caldwell said lowly as he passed her in the hall. "You're just giving him false hope. When he fails again, it'll be worse because of you." Denise did not reply, but his words dug deep. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, replaying every doubt she had buried. Was she overstepping? Was she gambling with a child's fragile confidence? But then she remembered Ethan's laugh when he drew the potato-shaped dog, his grin when he read a sentence all the way through without stopping. Those moments mattered more than the cynicism of a bitter man. She would not abandon him. Meanwhile, Ethan himself was wrestling with feelings he could barely name. He wanted desperately to make his father proud, to prove he was not worthless, but the fear of failing again clawed at him constantly. One night, after struggling through another reading passage, he pushed his books away and buried his face in his hands. "What's the point?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll never be good enough. Dad's right." Denise knelt beside him, her voice calm but resolute. "Ethan, listen to me. Your father doesn't decide your worth. This exam doesn't decide your worth. You are learning in your own way, and every step forward is proof of your strength. Do you know what I see when I look at you?" He shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "I see a boy who refuses to quit even when the world says he can't. That makes you braver than most men I know." The words struck him deeply, and slowly, Ethan lifted his head. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he wasn't broken. As the exam date approached, Denise intensified their lessons. She turned reading into a game, linking words with pictures, using colors and movement to make letters memorable. She taught Ethan to break down sentences into smaller parts, to take breaths and pace himself instead of rushing. Every evening they worked until exhaustion set in, but unlike before, Ethan no longer dreaded the books. He still struggled, but now he saw each mistake as a step closer, not a wall blocking him. One late evening, as the mansion lay in silence, Richard once again found himself standing outside the study room door. He expected to hear failure, tears, or frustration. Instead, he heard laughter. He peeked in and saw Ethan tracing words in flour on a tray while Denise clapped syllables. The boy's face was alight with joy, and for a fleeting moment Richard felt something he hadn't in years. Curiosity. Could it be possible that Denise was right? He quickly shook the thought away. Business had taught him not to trust sentiment. Numbers and numbers alone defined success. The night before the exam, Ethan sat nervously at the study table, chewing his pencil. Denise placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you know what matters most tomorrow?" she asked. "That I don't fail," he muttered. "No," she said firmly. "What matters is that you try with everything you have. Even if you stumble, even if you struggle, you do not give up. That is what will make you stronger." For the first time, Ethan went to bed not with dread, but with a quiet determination. He knew it would not be easy, but he also knew he was not alone. The following morning, as the exam papers were handed out in the classroom, Ethan felt his heart hammering in his chest. Words blurred, letters twisted, and fear threatened to overwhelm him. For a brief moment, he considered giving up before even starting. But then he remembered Denise's words echoing in his mind. "You are not broken. You are brave." He gripped his pencil and began. Hours later, when the exam ended, Ethan was not sure what he had achieved. He knew he had made mistakes, but he had finished every page. For him, that alone was victory. But when the results came a week later, the numbers told a harsher story. He had improved, yes, but still failed overall. When Richard saw the results, his fury erupted. "Enough!" he shouted, slamming the papers on the table. "This experiment is over. He will be sent away. I won't watch him humiliate this family any longer." Ethan's world shattered at those words. Tears burned in his eyes as he stared at his father, then at Denise, whose face was pale but resolute. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but unyielding. "Please, sir, give us one more chance. He is closer than you realize. Do not throw him away now." Richard's eyes narrowed. "One more chance? Why? So you can waste more of my time? So he can fail again?" But Denise did not back down. "Because he deserves it. Because he is not a failure. And if you send him away now, you will never forgive yourself when you realize what you lost." The room fell silent. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to Richard Reynolds without fear. And for a moment, just a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. Breaking point, the days after the practice exam were some of the heaviest Ethan had ever lived. Though Denise celebrated his progress and reminded him of the courage it took to finish every question, the sting of his father's words hung over him like storm clouds refusing to break. At school, other students whispered about him, some mocking, some pitying, but all of it made him shrink further into himself. At home, the silence from Richard was worse than anger. A father's disapproval was sharper than any punishment, and it carved into the boy's heart with every passing moment. Denise could see the weight pressing down on him, but even her words sometimes seemed too small to break through the storm in his head. She worked tirelessly, inventing new ways to help him grasp the lessons, but every time he stumbled, she saw him wince as though his father's voice were echoing in the back of his mind. The truth was clear. Ethan's greatest battle was not with words on a page, but with the belief that he was worthless. One evening, when the mansion was unusually quiet, Ethan wandered down the hall in search of water. He stopped when he heard his father's voice through the half-open study door. "I don't care what Denise says," Richard was muttering to a colleague on the phone. "The boy doesn't have it. He'll never have it. Some children are simply weak, and I refuse to waste more time pretending otherwise. Once the term ends, I'm sending him away. Out of sight, out of mind." The words sliced through Ethan like a blade. Weak. Worthless. Out of sight. Out of mind. He felt his knees go weak and he stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. Quietly, he returned to his room and collapsed on the bed, his body shaking. For the first time, he wondered if disappearing would be easier. For his father, for the household, maybe even for himself. When Denise found him later that evening, curled up and unresponsive, her heart broke. She sat beside him, stroking his hair gently, waiting until his breathing slowed enough to whisper, "What happened, Ethan?" Through tears, he told her. He repeated every word his father had said, each syllable heavy with the pain of rejection. Denise's chest tightened, anger and sorrow warring within her. She had known Richard could be cruel, but to dismiss his own son as though he were nothing, that was beyond cruelty, it was destruction. For a moment, Denise feared she would lose him, not just to failure but to despair. And so she did the only thing she could. She told him her own story. "When I was your age," she began softly, "people told me the same thing, that I was worthless, that I wasn't smart enough, not pretty enough, not strong enough. I wanted to believe them. But then one teacher, just one, saw something in me. She told me that the world is wrong when it tries to define us by our weakest moments. She said that strength is not about never falling. It's about standing again after you fall. And Ethan, that's what I see in you. You stand again, even when it hurts. That is bravery." Ethan wiped his face, looking at her with wide, searching eyes. "But what if I fail again? What if he's right?" "Then we try again," Denise said firmly, and again until you find the path that is yours. Because you are not broken, Ethan. You are not less. You are more than even your father knows. And one day the world will see it too." The boy clung to her words like a lifeline, and slowly, the darkness in his eyes gave way to a flicker of determination. Meanwhile, Denise herself was under growing pressure. The gossip among the staff had reached cruel heights. She overheard them joking that she was trying to play savior, that she was risking her livelihood for a hopeless cause. Some even bet secretly on how many weeks she would last before Richard dismissed her. Their laughter echoed in the corridors, but Denise refused to let it break her resolve. She thought of her daughter Sophia, whose college acceptance letter still hung on their fridge at home. And she thought of Ethan, who looked at her with trust no one else had earned. She could not, would not, abandon him now. The tension came to a head 1 week before the final exams. Richard, weary of seeing Denise spend so many hours with Ethan, summoned her to his study. He poured himself a drink and leaned back, studying her with sharp eyes. "Why do you persist?" he asked. "You must know he will fail. You must know I will hold you responsible. Are you prepared to ruin your life over a lost cause?" Denise stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Because he is not a lost cause. He is your son, Mr. Reynolds. And if you cannot see his worth, then shame on you. You can build towers, control markets, and command men, but if you cannot stand by your own child, then what do you truly have?" The words struck Richard harder than he expected. For a moment his face softened, but then his pride reasserted itself, and he waved her away, with irritation. "1 week, Denise, 1 week, or you're finished." When she returned to Ethan, she did not tell him of the conversation. She only told him they had 1 more week to show the world what he could do. They doubled their efforts, working late, into the night. She invented new strategies, breaking down long texts into smaller stories, creating visual maps for ideas, turning every word into a picture or rhythm. Ethan grew tired, his small hands trembling from writing, but he pressed on, determined not to give his father another reason to discard him. On the morning of the exam, Ethan was pale and trembling. He sat in the car outside school, gripping his pencil case like it was a lifeline. Denise, sitting beside him, took his hand. "Listen to me, Ethan. Today is not about being perfect. Today is about being brave. If you forget everything else I taught you, remember this. You are not broken. You are capable, you are enough." Ethan nodded slowly, inhaling deeply, and stepped out of the car with a courage that had taken months to build. Inside the exam hall, as he stared at the paper before him, panic clawed at his chest. The words blurred, the letters twisted, and fear whispered in his mind that his father was right. But then Denise's voice echoed inside him. You are not broken. You are brave. He closed his eyes, steadied his breathing, and began. For 3 hours he fought word by word, sentence by sentence. He stumbled, he corrected, he pressed on when every instinct told him to give up. When the time finally ended, his hands were shaking, but for the first time he had finished every page. That night he returned home exhausted, collapsing on his bed. Denise tucked him in, whispering, "No matter what the paper says, you have already won." And deep within the mansion, Richard poured another drink, his jaw tight as he muttered to himself, "We'll see. We'll see if the maid was right." What none of them knew was that the results, when they came, would not only test Ethan's future but shake the very foundation of the Reynolds family itself. The transformation. The week after the exams was the longest week Ethan had ever lived. Each day crawled forward with unbearable slowness, and every night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every question he had answered. Sometimes he was sure he had done well. Other times he convinced himself he had failed completely. The uncertainty gnawed at him, pulling him between hope and despair like waves dragging him out to sea. Denise tried to keep him calm, filling their evenings with quiet review sessions, light games, and gentle encouragement. She reminded him that no matter what the results said, he had already achieved something remarkable. He had faced the exam without giving up, and that alone was a victory, worth more than numbers on a page. But Ethan could not shake the fear of his father's judgment. He knew Richard would see only the scores, not the effort, and the thought of disappointing him again made his chest feel tight. Richard himself seemed restless during those days. He prowled the halls of the mansion like a man awaiting news that could tilt the balance of his empire. To him, the exam was not about Ethan. It was about legacy, pride, and reputation. He imagined the whispers of board members, the smirks of rivals, the pity of those who would learn that the billionaire's son could not even pass a simple school test. Every scenario stoked his anger, and every time he saw Denise with Ethan, laughter slipping between them during study breaks, he felt the sting of humiliation. How could a maid accomplish what specialists had failed to do? Finally, the envelope arrived. It was a thick, white packet sealed with the school's crest, and the moment it landed in Richard's hand, silence gripped the house. Ethan stood in the doorway of the study, his legs trembling, his throat dry. Denise hovered beside him, her own heart pounding. Richard tore the envelope open with sharp precision, his eyes scanning the pages. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Richard's brow furrowed, his lips parting as though he could not quite believe what he was reading. He looked again, slower this time, and then again, each line unraveling a truth he had not expected. "Passed," he muttered, his voice low. He passed. Ethan blinked, not daring to believe it. "What?" Richard looked up, his face unreadable. "You passed, Ethan. Not just barely. Your reading and writing scores improved by nearly 40%. Mathematics, average. Comprehension, satisfactory. Overall, you passed." The boy's knees nearly gave out beneath him. Tears welled in his eyes as relief washed over him like a flood. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a failure. He wasn't the boy everyone whispered about. The disappointment his father had written off. He was enough. Denise placed her hand on his shoulder, her smile radiant and warm. "I told you, Ethan. You are capable. You are not broken." But Richard remained silent, his gaze fixed on the paper as if trying to reconcile what it meant. He had built his life on control, on money, on hiring the best to achieve perfection. Yet it was not wealth, not tutors, not bribes that had saved his son. It was patience, love, and the unshakable faith of a woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a maid. The following evening, Richard summoned Denise to his study. She entered cautiously, unsure of what awaited her. Richard stood by the window, the city skyline glittering behind him. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice lower and softer than she had ever heard from him, he spoke. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "And worse, I underestimated my own son. I was wrong." Denise remained silent, her hands clasped, waiting. "You kept your word," Richard continued. "More than that, you accomplished what I thought impossible. I promised you a promotion if he passed. Consider this the fulfillment of that promise." He placed an envelope on the desk. Inside was not only a significant raise but also an offer. Denise would no longer serve as a maid. She would be Ethan's official mentor and learning coordinator, with full authority to design his path forward. Tears filled Denise's eyes as she accepted the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you, sir, but this was never about me. It was about Ethan. He only needed someone to believe in him." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed unable to respond. Finally, he nodded. "Perhaps, but it is rare to find someone willing to fight for another's potential. You have done for him what I could not." That night, for the first time in years, Richard knocked on his son's bedroom door. Ethan looked up in surprise as his father entered, holding the exam results. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of unspoken years pressing down on him. "Ethan," he said slowly, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something. I'm proud of you." The words hung in the air, almost unbelievable. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he could not speak. Then he threw his arms around his father, sobbing against his chest. Richard stiffened, unused to such displays, but then slowly, he placed his arms around his son. For the first time, the walls between them cracked. From that day forward, things began to change in the Reynolds household. Ethan still struggled. Dyslexia did not disappear overnight, but he no longer saw himself as a failure. With Denise's continued guidance, he found new ways to learn, new strengths to lean on. His grades improved steadily, and more importantly, his confidence blossomed. He began to speak up in class, to share ideas, to believe in the future that once seemed impossible. Denise herself became more than an employee. She became family. The staff who once mocked her now spoke of her with respect, silenced by the undeniable results she had achieved. And though Richard never admitted it aloud, he found himself consulting her not only about Ethan's education, but also about matters of patience and resilience he had long ignored. Years later, when Ethan stood on the stage at his high school graduation, his name called among the graduates, Richard sat in the front row with tears in his eyes. He remembered the boy who once cowered under his gaze, the boy he nearly abandoned, and he realized how close he had come to losing the greatest treasure of his life. As Ethan delivered a short speech, thanking the person who never gave up on me even when I gave up on myself, his eyes found Denise in the crowd, and she smiled through her tears. In the end, the story of Richard Reynolds and his son was not the story of wealth or power, but of humility, patience, and the transformative power of belief. Denise Carter, the maid no one thought capable, had unlocked a truth no fortune could buy. Sometimes the smallest act of faith can change a life forever. And as Richard watched his son toss his cap into the air, he whispered once more, not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, but as a father who had finally learned what mattered most, "I'm proud of you, son."